A young mother planned to visit her parents for Christmas, but she never showed up. Before the holiday, she suddenly stopped communicating and disappeared without a trace. Her parents began searching for their daughter, discovering strange and troubling clues. While investigating, the detectives encountered a shocking twist that left everyone stunned, as no one had ever experienced anything like it. It was this twist that helped the case progress and brought the horrifying truth to light. Melissa Wolfenbarger was born on September 9, 1977, in the small town of Locust Grove, Georgia, USA, the youngest in her family. Her older sister, who was 7 years her senior, helped their mother take care of her from day one. As they grew up, the two sisters shared a close relationship. In high school, Melissa met a guy named Christopher. After graduating, the two quickly got married and moved to a quiet suburban area near Atlanta, where Christopher worked at a glass manufacturing plant. Not long after settling in, Melissa became pregnant and gave birth to a daughter, followed by a son. In 1998, at the age of 21, Melissa spent most of her time at home taking care of the children. Despite her youth, she felt happy with her growing family. She made an effort to stay in touch and occasionally visited her parents and sister. But because of the distance and her responsibilities as a mother, these visits became less frequent. That year, the family planned to spend Christmas together. A month before, during Thanksgiving, Melissa had called her mother to ask for a special gift, a photograph of her grandfather. Her mother searched through family albums and found the perfect photo, ready for Melissa and the children to visit. However, when Christmas came, Melissa did not show up. At first, her parents thought she was just busy, as she had to take care of two young children and had recently picked up a job at a coffee shop to help support the family, as Christopher's income was insufficient to cover their expenses. But when time passed without any news from her, their worry grew. They couldn't call Melissa to ask why she hadn't arrived because her house didn't have a phone. And at the time, mobile phones were not common. Melissa often called her parents from her in-laws' house. But since the last call during Thanksgiving, no one had been able to reach her. Initially, they decided to wait. But when Melissa didn't call on her mother's birthday, their concern grew. By then, they felt something was wrong and decided to travel to Atlanta to check on her. This trip led to a disturbing discovery. Melissa and Christopher's house was completely empty. After asking neighbors, they learned that the family had moved right after Christmas, but no one knew where they had gone. This only confused her parents further, as they couldn't imagine that Melissa would move without informing them. Eventually, they contacted Christopher's parents, who helped them get in touch with him. However, what Christopher said made the situation even more puzzling. He claimed that Melissa had left him and the two children in December, saying she wanted to move to California to start a new life. According to Christopher, she had left everything behind, including the children, to go. Melissa's parents found this story unbelievable. First, they couldn't imagine Melissa, a young mother who loved her children, would abandon two children who were only 1 and 2 years old. Furthermore, if she truly wanted to leave, Melissa would have surely notified or contacted the family at some point. But that never happened. Despite their doubts, Christopher insisted on his story and refused to provide any further information. Uncertain of what to do next, Melissa's parents returned home, but they were determined to find their daughter at all costs. Over the following months, they tried to trace her whereabouts, contacting friends and relatives, but it seemed like Melissa had vanished without a trace. In the spring of 1999, Melissa's mother happened to see a news report about Atlanta police finding a human head in a plastic bag soaked in bleach in a dense forest. A few days later, 4 more bags containing different body parts were discovered. What immediately caught her attention was that the location was near Christopher's old workplace. A bad feeling overwhelmed her, and she feared the body parts might belong to her daughter. However, the police later determined that the head belonged to a man who had gone missing in another unsolved case. By early 2000, Melissa's parents decided to report the matter to the police. However, the investigation yielded little progress. Investigators interviewed Christopher and concluded that Melissa might have voluntarily left her family to start a new life, which was why she hadn't contacted anyone, including the police. As a result, the police didn't pursue the case. However, Melissa's parents didn't believe she would leave everything behind like that. They were increasingly convinced that something serious had happened and began to suspect that Christopher might be involved in their daughter's disappearance. They also knew that Melissa and Christopher's relationship hadn't been smooth. Christopher had abused Melissa, forcing her to leave him multiple times and return to live with her parents with the children. However, each time, Christopher apologized and persuaded her to come back. This made the story of Melissa leaving without notifying her family even harder to believe. If Christopher had done everything to get her back in the past, why didn't he take any action this time? He didn't report to the police, didn't contact her family, and didn't try to stop her from leaving. Another detail that made Christopher's story stranger was that, according to him, Melissa hadn't taken anything with her when she left, not clothes, jewelry, or even identification. This made the situation even more suspicious. However, without the support of the police, Melissa's parents felt helpless and couldn't do anything further. In the following years, there were still no signs of Melissa, but in 2003, everything suddenly changed in an unexpected way. The police reopened a 1977 murder case that had been cold for 26 years. After reviewing evidence and conducting DNA tests, detectives identified the murderer as Carl Patton, Melissa's father. However, this was just the beginning of the story. When arrested, Carl made an astonishing offer. He was willing to confess to 3 other murders in exchange for full immunity for his wife, Melissa's mother. In return, Melissa's mother agreed to testify against her husband, and she was granted immunity. According to their confession, in December 1977, a woman named Mary, who had a close relationship with Carl, offered him $155,000 to kill her husband. Mary claimed her husband was cheating and wanted to collect his life insurance money. Carl agreed and enlisted a friend to help with the murder. However, when they approached the husband, he was with his mistress. This led Carl and his accomplice to decide to kill both. They dumped the woman's body into a river, while the man's body was placed in a car and left on a train track to make it look like an accident. About a month later, Carl told his wife that his accomplice had apparently revealed the crime to his girlfriend, and Carl decided to deal with both of them. Carl invited the couple to his home, killed them, and, along with his wife, cleaned up the crime scene. They used a truck to transport the bodies and threw them into the river. Carl also confessed to another murder that occurred 5 years before the others. This time, it was Mary again who suggested that he kill her first husband to collect the insurance money. Carl agreed to carry out this murder. In total, Carl was charged with 5 murders, and the police immediately suspected him of being involved in Melissa's disappearance. However, Carl insisted that he would never harm his daughter and had no connection to her disappearance. After an investigation, detectives concluded that Carl's testimony could be truthful. Although they initially suspected him in 1 murder, Carl voluntarily confessed to 4 other crimes. He claimed that regret had driven him to make these confessions. However, the story took an even more surprising turn when Carl made an unusual request. He wanted to meet directly with the lead detective who had charged him with murder and said, "You caught me, so maybe you'll find my daughter." The detective was intrigued by this situation. A man who had confessed to 5 murders asking the police to investigate the disappearance of his own daughter. It was a strange scenario, but the detective agreed to revisit the case. When reviewing the scarce information about Melissa's disappearance, he quickly noticed an important detail. The bags containing human remains were found near Christopher's workplace, Melissa's husband, for years earlier. At the time the remains were found, the police had initially assumed they belonged to a man. But this assumption was based on guesswork rather than forensic evidence. Upon reopening the case, the detective decided to re-examine the remains and requested DNA testing. Using Carl's DNA that was already in their records, the results confirmed that the remains did not belong to a man but to Melissa. This was a major breakthrough in the case, confirming that Melissa had been dead for many years rather than simply missing. Her case was officially reclassified as a homicide. According to the coroner's report, Melissa's body had been dismembered with a chainsaw. Her torso was never found, making the case even more mysterious. Despite extensive searches in the forest where the remains were discovered, no other body parts were located. An important clue emerged when investigators dug deeper into Christopher, Melissa's husband, and interviewed his former employer at the glass factory where he had worked. They discovered that Christopher had been fired at the time of Melissa's disappearance for allegedly stealing a chainsaw, the same tool used to dismember Melissa's body. Melissa's mother also revealed that Christopher had a history of abusing Melissa. Moreover, he had a criminal record, further raising suspicions about him. Another suspicious detail was that Christopher had changed his name right after Melissa died without providing a clear reason. All of these things made him the prime suspect in the murder, but the police lacked concrete evidence to charge him. In several interrogations, Christopher continued to stick to his original story that Melissa had run away with a lover, and she hadn't contacted anyone because she wanted to buy a fake ID. However, he often changed details of his story, which further raised doubts from the police. Another disturbing fact was that right after moving out of the house the family had lived in, Christopher left the two young children with his parents to care for them. He rarely visited and played no active role in their lives. The children didn't even recognize that Christopher was their father. All of these details led the police to believe that Christopher might be the killer. However, they could not proceed with an arrest without clear evidence. Detectives then obtained a search warrant for the house where Melissa had lived before she died. Since the killer had used a chainsaw, the police believed the murder had likely occurred in this house. Forensic experts meticulously examined every inch of the house, taking samples from the floor and other surfaces. Unfortunately, their analysis did not yield any useful results. Forensic technology at the time was not as advanced as it is today, so detectives had to store the collected evidence in the evidence locker, hoping that one day it could be used to crack the case. The detectives continued their efforts to find new clues and tried to interrogate Christopher to extract information, but all attempts were unsuccessful. Eventually, the case went cold for many years. Meanwhile, Melissa's father was sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences plus 20 years in prison. Mary, the woman who had hired him to commit the murders, died in the late 1980s and never faced any punishment. Melissa's mother and sister never gave up hope and continued to push for the investigation. They worked to keep the case in the media spotlight and maintained regular contact with the detectives. However, all their efforts yielded no progress until 2017. Melissa's mother, never losing hope of finding justice for her daughter, attended an event for those passionate about unsolved cases. At the event, participants discussed cases and looked for new clues. One of the participants was Cheryl McCullum, a criminal analyst. Melissa's mother decided to ask Cheryl for help and shared the entire story of her daughter's disappearance. What caught Cheryl's attention immediately was when Melissa's mother said, "My husband killed 5 people, and I helped him." This statement piqued Cheryl's curiosity. After the event, she began to dig deeper into the case, speaking thoroughly with Melissa's family and even keeping in touch with her father, who was serving time in prison. Cheryl was struck by how Carl, a man who had killed 5 people, seemed more concerned about the fact that his daughter's case might never be solved. Over the next few years, Cheryl gathered all the available information about the case. After compiling it, she concluded that the most obvious suspect was Christopher, Melissa's husband. Although there was no direct evidence against him, the overwhelming circumstantial evidence painted a troubling picture, leaving little room for doubt about Christopher's involvement. Christopher had a history of domestic violence with Melissa, made no effort to search for her after she went missing, and continued his life as if nothing had happened. However, the most damning detail was that just before Melissa died, Christopher had been accused by his employer of stealing the exact type of chainsaw used to dismember her. Not only Melissa's family, but even her children believed that Christopher was involved in the case. When Cheryl began looking into the case, Melissa's now-grown children also tried to help her in the pursuit of justice. Cheryl consulted with numerous experts in the criminal community, including famous journalist Nancy Grace and several law enforcement officials. After carefully analyzing the evidence Cheryl had gathered, all of them agreed that Christopher was the prime suspect, though there was still no irrefutable evidence to prosecute him. However, the case remained at a standstill. Nancy Grace suggested that Cheryl start a podcast to draw wider attention to the case. She emphasized that publicizing a case often helps bring forward new witnesses, individuals who may not realize the significance of the information they hold, and this could change the course of the investigation. Cheryl agreed, and in 2023, she launched the first episode of her podcast about Melissa's case. The podcast quickly gained the community's interest, and Cheryl recorded many episodes featuring Melissa's mother and other family members. She presented all the information she had collected over the years, but there was still no significant progress in the case. It wasn't until April 2024 that a major breakthrough occurred. After Cheryl released a new episode, a witness came forward. The person explained that he had stumbled upon the podcast and may hold valuable information. He revealed that just before Melissa disappeared, he had witnessed a severe argument between her and Christopher. According to some sources, during the argument, Christopher allegedly threatened Melissa. The detectives decided to keep the details of this testimony confidential to protect the integrity of the investigation. Cheryl shared the witness's account on the podcast, which helped draw public interest back to the case. The police revisited Melissa's case after this important turn of events, which prompted them to reopen the investigation that lasted 3 months. During this time, the detectives carefully reviewed all case files, interviewed people involved, and re-examined evidence using modern technology. Forensic experts also analyzed bags of human remains and various samples from Christopher and Melissa's home, which was believed to be the crime scene. In August 2024, the police held a press conference to announce that, after 25 years, Christopher, Melissa's husband, had been arrested for murder. Based on the witness testimony and new findings, the police believed they had enough evidence to charge him. However, the specific details of the new evidence have not been revealed. Some sources suggest that modern forensic tools uncovered DNA traces or other key evidence linking Christopher to the murder. Keeping details confidential is common in serious cases to minimize the chance of the defense using them to challenge evidence in court. Christopher is currently in custody, awaiting a preliminary hearing, where he will decide whether to plead guilty or not. Melissa's family believes that Christopher will not escape justice, and the detectives are confident that the evidence they have is hard to dispute. Melissa's story has spread nationwide with shocking details. Interestingly, police initially confirmed her death through her father's arrest, after he confessed to 5 murders and asked the police to investigate his daughter's disappearance. Later, Cheryl McCollum's podcast drew public attention, leading to witness testimony and the reopening of the investigation. Eventually, Christopher was arrested. Melissa's children also believe their father is guilty and hope that justice will be served soon. While awaiting the verdict, they want to understand the full truth and Christopher's motive. However, this can only happen if he chooses to confess. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.